Melanie's heart pounded against her ribcage as she sat in the harsh, fluorescent light of the hospital waiting room. She had been sitting there for hours, staring at the same cracked tile on the floor, her mind racing, grasping for answers that didn't exist. The only man she had ever loved, Jared, was lying on an operating table, his life hanging by a thread. The victim of a tragic accident, his body was broken, barely clinging to life. The doctors had told her that he needed emergency surgery, a complex and costly procedure, and without it, he wouldn't survive the night. She had no time, no resources, no options. Melanie had already poured every bit of her savings into Jared's medical bills over the past few days. She had sold her jewelry, borrowed money from friends, and even considered going to loan sharks, but the amount required for the surgery was insurmountable. Now, the clock was ticking, and she was drowning in hopelessness. Dr. Daniel Grayson, the highly respected surgeon, walked into the room. Melanie had heard of him. His reputation for saving lives was unmatched. Tall, composed, and impossibly handsome, Daniel had an air of authority that made you feel like you were in safe hands. His deep blue eyes, so calm and piercing, held your gaze as though he could see right through your soul. "Miss Sawyer," Daniel spoke in a low, steady voice. "We've run through every option, but the truth is, Jared needs this surgery now. Without it, I'm afraid he won't make it." Melanie swallowed hard, her throat dry. I don't have the money for it. I've tried everything." Daniel looked at her, his expression unreadable for a moment before he spoke again, this time more softly. "There might be another way." Melanie's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" He hesitated before continuing. "I'm willing to waive the upfront costs of the surgery, but in return, I would ask for something personal." Her mind reeled at his words, unsure of what he was implying. "Personal," she whispered, dread already pooling in her stomach. "One night," Daniel said, his eyes locking with hers. "One night with you. No strings attached. After that, Jared will get the surgery, and you won't owe anything. It's your choice." Time seemed to stop. The walls of the hospital felt like they were closing in on her. A flood of emotions washed over her. Disgust, anger, desperation, and fear. She wanted to scream, to slap him for even suggesting such a thing. How could he ask this of her? How could he demand her body in exchange for the life of the man she loved? But then, Jared's face flashed in her mind. His warm smile, the way his hand felt in hers, the life they had built together. If she refused, he would die. If she accepted, she would carry the weight of that decision forever. Tears welled in her eyes, and she struggled to breathe under the crushing weight of it all. How could you ask me this?" she finally managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. Daniel's expression didn't change, but his eyes softened, as if he understood the torment she was going through. "I don't expect you to understand, but it's the only offer I can make. I'll give you time to decide, but not much. Jared doesn't have long." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving her in the suffocating silence of her impossible decision. Melanie sat in the hospital chapel, her hands gripping the edge of the wooden pew as she tried to gather her thoughts. The weight of Dr. Grayson's offer hung heavy on her shoulders, and her mind raced with questions, guilt, and fear. She felt sick, torn between her love for Jared and the overwhelming disgust at the choice she was being forced to make. She glanced at the cross above the altar, wondering if there was any forgiveness for what she was about to do. Could she live with herself knowing that she had given in to such an unspeakable demand? Could Jared ever forgive her if he knew? As the minutes ticked by, her decision became clearer, though no less painful. She had no other option. She had to save Jared, no matter the cost to herself. With a deep breath, Melanie stood, her legs trembling beneath her, and made her way back to the hospital. When she found Dr. Grayson in his office, she felt numb, as if her body was moving on autopilot. "I'll do it," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Daniel looked at her, his face unreadable. For a moment, she thought she saw a flicker of regret in his eyes. but it was gone as quickly as it appeared. He nodded, standing from his desk. "We'll go to my place. I'll make the arrangements for Jared's surgery in the morning." Melanie followed him in silence, her mind shutting down as they left the hospital. She refused to think about what was about to happen, refused to feel the weight of her decision. For the rest of the night, she would focus on one thing: saving Jared. Daniel's apartment was as luxurious as she had expected. Everything about it was modern, sleek, and expensive, just like him. Melanie's heart raced as she stepped inside, but Daniel's demeanor was unexpectedly calm. He wasn't cruel or lecherous. In fact, he seemed almost detached, as though this was merely a transaction. "I'll pour us a drink," he said, walking to the kitchen. "You don't have to be afraid." But how could she not be? Every fiber of her being was screaming at her to leave, to run, but she stayed. She had to. When Daniel handed her a glass of wine, she took it, gulping it down in one swift motion, anything to dull the edge of what was about to happen. The night passed in a haze of guilt and numbness. Daniel didn't force himself on her. In fact, he was gentle, almost respectful, but that didn't make it any easier. Melanie felt as though she was watching it all unfold from outside her own body, disconnected from the moment. When it was over, she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, her heart heavy with the knowledge of what she had done. Daniel didn't speak, and neither did she. He simply got up and left the room, leaving her alone with her thoughts. Melanie left Daniel's apartment early the next morning, feeling as though she had left a part of herself behind. She returned to the hospital, where Jared's surgery was already scheduled. The weight of what had happened pressed down on her chest like a heavy stone, but she kept moving forward. She had no other choice. Daniel performed the surgery without a word. His demeanor was as professional as ever, and to anyone watching, it would seem as though nothing out of the ordinary had transpired between them. But Melanie knew the truth. The secret they shared hung over her like a dark cloud, and she wondered how long it would take before it consumed her completely. The hours passed slowly as Melanie sat in the waiting room, praying that the surgery would be successful. Every time a nurse or doctor walked by, her heart skipped a beat, fearing the worst. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Daniel emerged from the operating room, his scrubs stained with the remnants of the procedure. He approached her, his expression calm and collected. "The surgery went well," he said. "Jared will recover, but it'll take time." Relief flooded through Melanie, and for the first time in days, she allowed herself to breathe. Jared was going to live. He was going to be okay. But the weight of what she had done to save him still lingered, casting a shadow over her relief. "Thank you," she whispered, unable to meet Daniel's gaze. He nodded, his voice quiet but firm. "You did what you had to do. Now focus on helping him recover." As he walked away, Melanie was left with the stark reality of her situation. Jared was alive, but the cost of his life had been her own dignity. She couldn't undo what had happened, and she didn't know if she could ever forgive herself. In the days that followed Jared's surgery, Melanie spent every waking moment by his bedside. She held his hand, spoke to him softly, and tried to keep her guilt from bubbling to the surface. When Jared finally opened his eyes and saw her for the first time since the accident, tears welled in her eyes. "You're awake," she whispered, her voice cracking. Jared gave her a weak smile. "I'm alive because of you." Melanie forced a smile in return, but the truth gnawed at her from the inside. He didn't know what she had sacrificed to save him. He didn't know about the night she had spent with Dr. Grayson, and she didn't know if she would ever be able to tell him. As Jared recovered, their relationship became strained. He grew frustrated with his limitations, angry at his slow progress, and distant from her. The Jared she had known, the man she had loved, seemed to have vanished. In his place was someone bitter and resentful, and Melanie struggled to find a way to reach him. Every time Dr. Grayson came to check on Jared's recovery, Melanie's stomach churned. Their secret was a constant presence in the room, a dark reminder of the price she had paid. Weeks turned into months, and as Jared continued his recovery, the fractures in his and Melanie's relationship grew wider and deeper. What had once been a loving, passionate partnership had morphed into a strained, fragile connection held together only by the thin thread of obligation. Jared's once tender gaze had hardened, his mood shifting from frustrated to distant, as if the accident had taken not only his strength, but also the very essence of the man he once was. Melanie, on the other hand, was suffocating under the weight of her guilt. Each day she replayed that fateful night with Dr. Grayson, her mind tormenting her with vivid recollections of the decision she had made to save Jared's life. The sacrifice she had given was eating her from the inside out. She felt like a shell of her former self, no longer the bright, hopeful woman she had once been. But she couldn't tell Jared, not now, not ever. He was still recovering, physically and mentally. If he knew the truth, it would destroy him, and any hope they had left of saving their relationship would be lost forever. One night, as she stood in the kitchen preparing dinner, Jared shuffled in, his steps slow and labored. His physical therapy had improved his condition, but he still had a long road ahead. "Hey," Melanie said softly, setting down the knife she had been using to chop vegetables. "How are you feeling today? Did the session go well?" Jared grunted, barely acknowledging her, and sat at the table with a pained expression on his face. He rubbed his knee absent-mindedly, the constant reminder of his injury gnawing at him. "I'm fine," he muttered, his voice curt. Melanie tried to smile, but it faltered. She missed the days when they could talk for hours, laugh, and share their dreams. Now, it was as if they were strangers living under the same roof. "Jared, we need to talk," she said hesitantly, turning to face him. "I feel like something's changed between us. We've been through so much, and I know this recovery is hard, but I miss you. I miss us." He glanced up at her, his eyes cold. "You think I don't know that, Melanie? You think I don't feel like a burden every single day? That I'm not a shadow of the man I used to be?" "That's not what I meant," she protested, her voice soft but firm. "I'm just trying to help." "I don't need your help," he snapped, pushing himself up from the table and limping toward the living room. "I don't need you hovering over me all the time, making me feel even more pathetic than I already do." Melanie stood frozen in the kitchen, her heart sinking as she watched him walk away. The man she loved was slipping further and further away, and no matter how hard she tried to hold on, it felt like she was grasping at sand. The days blurred into one another as Melanie tried to keep her life from completely unraveling. She focused on her work, taking extra shifts at the office, hoping to drown her emotions in the monotony of everyday tasks. But no matter how busy she kept herself, the guilt still lingered, always waiting in the shadows to resurface. It was during one of these long days at work that she found herself crossing paths with Dr. Daniel Grayson once again. She had been avoiding him ever since Jared's surgery, their one night together a secret she wished she could forget. But fate had other plans. Melanie was walking through the hospital corridors after visiting a friend when she suddenly heard a familiar voice behind her. "Melanie?" Her heart raced as she turned to see Daniel standing there, his piercing blue eyes fixed on her. For a moment, she couldn't find the words to respond. Seeing him brought everything back, the anguish, the guilt, the night she had spent with him to save Jared's life. "Dr. Grayson," she managed, her voice tense. Daniel stepped closer, his expression unreadable. "You don't have to call me that. We've been through too much for formalities, don't you think?" Melanie's breath caught in her throat. She wanted to turn and walk away, but something in his gaze held her in place. "I haven't seen you around since the surgery," Daniel said softly, his tone gentler than she expected. "How is Jared doing?" "He's recovering," Melanie replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's been hard." Daniel nodded, his eyes scanning her face as if he could see the weight she was carrying. "And how are you doing?" Melanie's heart tightened in her chest. No one had asked her that in months. Everyone had been focused on Jared, on his recovery, on his needs. No one had thought to ask how she was coping with the crushing burden of it all. "I'm fine," she lied, forcing a tight smile. But Daniel wasn't fooled. He could see the cracks in her facade, the way her shoulders slumped under the invisible weight she carried. "If you ever need to talk," he began, his voice soft, "I'm here." Melanie swallowed hard, her mind spinning with conflicting emotions. Part of her wanted to flee, to never see him again, but another part, a small, desperate part, felt drawn to the only man who knew the full extent of her sacrifice. "I appreciate that," she whispered before turning and walking away, leaving Daniel standing there, watching her retreating figure. As the weeks wore on, Melanie's relationship with Jared continued to deteriorate. His physical therapy sessions were helping him regain strength, but his mood only grew darker. He was becoming more withdrawn, more bitter, and the love that had once bound them together was now suffocated by resentment. One night, as Melanie sat on the edge of the bed, watching Jared sleep, she felt a deep sense of sorrow wash over her. This wasn't the life she had imagined. This wasn't the love she had fought so hard to protect. The man lying next to her was a stranger, and no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't reach him. The guilt of her secret affair with Daniel weighed heavily on her soul. It was a secret she carried alone, and it was slowly destroying her from the inside out. Every time she looked at Jared, she was reminded of the night she had spent with Daniel, the night that had saved his life but cost her so much. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand, pulling her from her thoughts. She glanced at the screen and saw an unexpected message from Daniel. "We need to talk. Can we meet?" Melanie's heart skipped a beat as she stared at the message. She knew she shouldn't see him again. She knew it would only complicate things further, but something inside her couldn't resist. Maybe it was the fact that Daniel had been the only one who had asked how she was doing. Maybe it was the guilt she still carried. Or maybe, deep down, she was looking for an escape from the suffocating life she was living. Against her better judgment, she replied, "Okay." Melanie sat across from Daniel in a quiet cafe, her hands trembling as she gripped her cup of coffee. She hadn't been alone with him since that night, and the tension between them was palpable. She couldn't meet his gaze, afraid of what she might see, afraid of what she might feel. "Thank you for coming," Daniel said softly, breaking the silence. Melanie nodded, her throat tight. "What do you want, Daniel?" He sighed, leaning forward slightly, his intense gaze never leaving her. "I've been thinking about everything that happened. About you, about Jared, about us." "There is no us," Melanie said quickly, her voice sharp. "What happened between us, it was a mistake. It was a desperate decision I made to save Jared's life. That's all." Daniel looked at her, his expression unreadable. "I know that's what you tell yourself, but I can see the truth. You're not happy, Melanie. I can see it in your eyes." Her heart pounded in her chest. How could he see so clearly what she had tried so hard to hide? "Jared loves you," Daniel continued, his voice softening, "but he's not the man you need anymore. You've changed, Melanie. You're stronger than you think." Tears welled in her eyes as she looked down at her hands. "I don't know what to do, Daniel. I'm lost. I feel like I'm drowning." Daniel reached across the table, taking her hand in his. His touch was warm, comforting in a way she hadn't felt in so long. "You're not alone," he whispered, his voice steady. "You don't have to carry this burden by yourself." Melanie's heart raced as she looked up into his eyes, feeling a pull toward him that she hadn't expected. It was dangerous, intoxicating, and yet, in that moment, it felt like the only thing that made sense. She didn't know how or when it had happened, but she realized that she was falling for him. The man who had saved Jared's life, the man who had asked for a piece of her soul in return. Melanie returned home from her meeting with Daniel, her mind a whirlwind of emotions. As she opened the door to the apartment she shared with Jared, the familiar sense of heaviness settled over her. Jared was sitting on the couch, flipping aimlessly through the channels. He barely acknowledged her as she walked in, his eyes distant, his jaw clenched. "Hey," she greeted softly, trying to hide the inner turmoil she felt. "Hey," he replied flatly, not looking up. She could feel the tension between them, thicker than ever. Every day, it felt like they were drifting further apart, like two ships passing in the night, destined for different horizons. Melanie stood in the kitchen, the weight of everything pressing down on her. Jared's recovery had been long and arduous, but the emotional distance between them was even more unbearable. "I saw Dr. Grayson today," she blurted out, unable to keep the secret any longer. Jared paused, his hand on the remote stilling. "Dr. Grayson?" he repeated, his voice carefully neutral. "Why would you need to see him?" Melanie took a deep breath, trying to steady her racing heart. "We just ran into each other at the hospital." "And you decided to have a little chat?" Jared's tone was sharper now, suspicion lacing his words. Melanie hesitated, unsure of how much to tell him. She didn't want to hurt him, didn't want to bring up all the complicated feelings that had been swirling in her heart ever since that night with Daniel. "Mel, what aren't you telling me?" Jared pressed, his voice growing colder. She swallowed hard, her guilt and fear threatening to consume her. "Jared, that night before your surgery, there's something I didn't tell you." His gaze snapped up to meet hers, his eyes narrowing. "What are you talking about?" "I didn't know what else to do," she said, her voice trembling. "We couldn't afford your surgery, and you were dying, Jared. I couldn't let that happen." He stared at her, his expression unreadable. "What did you do, Melanie?" The words stuck in her throat, but she forced herself to continue. "I made a deal with Dr. Grayson. I spent the night with him to save your life." Jared froze, the remote slipping from his hand and clattering onto the floor. The silence in the room was deafening, a thick, suffocating blanket of shock and disbelief. He stared at her, his face a mask of horror and rage. "You what?" His voice was barely above a whisper, but the fury in his tone was unmistakable. "I didn't have a choice," Melanie whispered, tears streaming down her face. "You were dying, Jared. I couldn't let you go." Jared shot up from the couch, his face twisted with anger. "So, you slept with him? You thought that was the only way?" "I thought it was the only way to save you," Melanie cried, her voice breaking. "I did it for you." He shook his head, his hands balling into fists. "You betrayed me." "I didn't want to," she sobbed, reaching for him, but he recoiled from her touch. "Jared, please, don't touch me," he shouted, his voice filled with venom. "I can't even look at you right now." Melanie flinched, her heart shattering into a million pieces. The man she had sacrificed everything for was now looking at her like she was a stranger. She could see the pain in his eyes, the hurt she had caused. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I'm so sorry." But Jared didn't respond. He stormed out of the apartment, slamming the door behind him, leaving Melanie standing in the middle of the kitchen, alone and broken. The days following Jared's departure were the hardest Melanie had ever experienced. She stayed in the apartment, hoping against hope that he would come back, that they could somehow find a way to mend what had been broken. But Jared didn't return, and the silence in the apartment grew more deafening with each passing hour. Melanie tried calling him, leaving messages that went unanswered. She couldn't blame him. How could she? She had crossed a line that could never be undone, and now she was left to face the consequences of her actions alone. It was late one night when there was a knock on her door. Melanie's heart leapt into her throat as she hurried to answer it, praying it was Jared. But when she opened the door, she found herself face to face with Daniel. "Daniel," she breathed, her surprise evident. "I'm sorry to come unannounced," Daniel said, his expression unreadable. I couldn't stop thinking about you." Melanie's heart raced as she stepped aside to let him in. She hadn't expected to see him again. Not like this, but there was something in his eyes, something she hadn't seen before. Concern, maybe even regret. "I heard about what happened with Jared," Daniel said, his voice soft. "I know it's not my place, but I wanted to make sure you're okay." Melanie sank onto the couch, burying her face in her hands. "I don't know what to do, Daniel. Everything is falling apart." Daniel sat beside her, his presence calm and steady. "I'm here for you, Melanie. Whatever you need, I'm here." His words brought a strange sense of comfort, but they also stirred something deeper within her, an ache she had been trying to ignore. She glanced at him, her emotions swirling inside her like a storm. The night they had spent together, the guilt that had haunted her, and now the undeniable connection she felt with him. It was all too much. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen," she whispered, her voice shaky. "I just wanted to save Jared." "I know," Daniel replied gently, "and you did." "But at what cost?" she asked, her voice breaking. "I've lost him, Daniel. I've lost everything." Daniel hesitated for a moment before reaching out to gently touch her hand. "You haven't lost everything, Melanie." She looked up at him, her eyes filled with tears. "What do you mean?" He held her gaze, his voice steady and sincere. "You still have a future. Maybe it's not the one you thought you would have, but it's still yours, and I want to be a part of it." Melanie's heart skipped a beat as she stared at him. There was something in his eyes, something raw and honest that made her feel seen, truly seen, for the first time in a long time. "I don't know if I can," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You don't have to decide right now," Daniel said softly, "but just know that I care about you, Melanie. I've cared about you since the moment we met." Her chest tightened at his words. She had spent so long carrying the guilt of what had happened between them, but now, for the first time, she was starting to see things differently. Maybe Daniel wasn't just the doctor who had saved Jared's life. Maybe he was something more. The weeks passed, and Jared still hadn't returned. Melanie threw herself into her work, trying to distract herself from the pain and uncertainty that lingered in her heart. But no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't shake the growing connection she felt with Daniel. They had started seeing each other more frequently, meeting for coffee or walks in the park. At first, it had been innocent, just two people finding comfort in each other's company. But as time went on, Melanie couldn't deny the pull she felt toward him. He was kind, understanding, and unlike Jared, he made her feel like she wasn't drowning. One evening, as they walked along the riverbank, Daniel stopped and turned to face her. "Melanie, there's something I need to say." Her heart pounded in her chest as she looked up at him, unsure of what was coming next. "I know things have been complicated between us," Daniel began, his voice steady, "but I can't pretend anymore. I care about you, Melanie, more than I should." Melanie's breath caught in her throat. She had known this moment was coming, but now that it was here, she didn't know how to respond. "I know you're still hurting over Jared," Daniel continued, his eyes searching hers, "and I don't want to rush you, but I want you to know that I'm here. I've always been here, and if you're ready, I want to be with you." Tears welled up in Melanie's eyes as she listened to his words. It was everything she had been afraid to admit to herself, that maybe, just maybe, Daniel was the person she needed in her life now. "I don't know if I'm ready," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I'm scared, Daniel. I've made so many mistakes." "We all have," Daniel said gently, taking her hand in his, "but that doesn't mean we can't find happiness again." Melanie looked into his eyes, and for the first time in a long time, she felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe her life hadn't turned out the way she had planned, but that didn't mean it was over. Maybe, with Daniel, she could start again. "I want to try," she said softly, her voice barely audible. "I want to try with you." Daniel's face broke into a smile, and he pulled her into his arms, holding her close as the weight of her past began to lift. For the first time in what felt like forever, Melanie allowed herself to hope. Hope for a future she hadn't dared to dream of. Hope for a love that could heal the wounds of her past. As they stood there, wrapped in each other's embrace, Melanie realized that maybe, just maybe, she hadn't lost everything after all. As the weeks passed, Melanie and Daniel's bond deepened. It wasn't a whirlwind romance filled with grand gestures, but something quieter, steadier. Every moment with him felt like a step towards healing, like a balm for her heart. They spent more time together, and the emotional weight that once defined Melanie's life started to lift. She was beginning to breathe again. One evening, Daniel invited her to his place for dinner. He lived in a cozy apartment with a view of the city skyline, and the atmosphere was always warm and inviting. The two of them stood in the kitchen, cooking together. Melanie felt a sense of peace as they moved in sync, chopping vegetables and stirring sauces. She couldn't remember the last time she had felt so at ease. As they sat down to eat, Daniel poured them each a glass of wine, and for the first time, Melanie allowed herself to truly relax. She smiled at him, a genuine smile that reached her eyes. "You look different tonight," Daniel said, his voice soft and full of admiration. Melanie raised an eyebrow. "Different how?" "Lighter. Happier," he said, his gaze warm and affectionate. She blushed, looking down at her plate. "I think I'm starting to find myself again." "That makes me happy," Daniel said, reaching across the table to take her hand. "I've wanted to see you like this for a long time." Melanie's heart fluttered at his touch. She had spent so long feeling lost, but Daniel had been there, patiently waiting, supporting her through her darkest moments. Now, as they sat together in the soft glow of candlelight, Melanie realized how much she had come to care for him. But as much as she wanted to embrace the happiness she was beginning to feel, there was still one part of her life that remained unresolved: Jared. Though Jared hadn't contacted her since that fateful night, Melanie's mind often wandered to him. She wondered where he was, how he was doing, and whether he had found a way to move forward. She knew she had hurt him deeply, and part of her felt a lingering guilt. She needed closure, not just for herself but for Jared too. One night, while lying in bed next to Daniel, Melanie made a decision. She would reach out to Jared. It was the only way she could fully move on. The next morning, she sent Jared a message, asking if they could meet. To her surprise, he responded within the hour. They arranged to meet at a quiet cafe near their old apartment. Melanie's heart raced as she approached the cafe, unsure of what to expect. When she walked in, she spotted Jared sitting by the window, staring out at the street. He looked different, thinner, more tired. Melanie approached cautiously, unsure of how to start. "Jared," she said softly as she sat down across from him. He glanced up at her, his expression unreadable. "Melanie." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The weight of everything that had happened hung heavy between them. "I'm sorry," Melanie finally said, breaking the silence. "For everything." Jared's eyes softened slightly, but he didn't respond immediately. He stared down at his hands before speaking. "I never wanted things to end this way." "Neither did I," Melanie whispered. Jared looked up, his eyes filled with pain. "I loved you, Melanie, but after what happened, I just couldn't get past it." "I know," Melanie said, her voice thick with emotion, "and I don't expect you to forgive me, but I needed to tell you that I never meant to hurt you." Jared sighed, leaning back in his chair. "I know you didn't, but that doesn't change what happened." They sat in silence for a while, the memories of their past relationships swirling around them. Melanie felt a pang of sadness, but also a sense of relief. They had been through so much, but it was time to let go. It was time to move on. "I'm with someone else now," Jared said after a long pause, his voice quiet. Melanie blinked, taken aback by the confession. "Oh." "Her name's Sarah," he continued, a hint of a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "She's helping me heal." Melanie nodded, her heart swelling with a mix of emotions: relief, sadness, and a strange sense of closure. "I'm happy for you, Jared. Truly." He nodded, the tension between them finally beginning to dissolve. "I'm glad we could talk." "Me too," Melanie said, smiling softly. "Take care of yourself, Jared." "You too, Mel." As Melanie left the cafe, she felt lighter than she had in months. It wasn't easy, but she had finally closed that chapter of her life. And as she walked out into the bright sunlight, she knew that her future with Daniel was just beginning. With the closure Melanie had found with Jared, she was finally able to open her heart fully to Daniel. The love between them blossomed, no longer overshadowed by the past or the guilt she had carried. They spent more time together, falling deeper in love as the days turned into weeks. One evening, Daniel surprised Melanie with a trip to the beach. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow across the sand as they walked hand in hand along the shore. Melanie felt at peace, truly at peace for the first time in years. As they strolled along the water's edge, Daniel stopped suddenly, turning to face her. Melanie's heart raced as she saw the intensity in his eyes. "Melanie," he began, his voice steady and sincere, "I've loved you for a long time. From the moment we met, I knew you were special. And even through everything we've been through, that love has only grown stronger." Tears welled up in Melanie's eyes as she listened to his words. She had never imagined finding love again after everything she had been through. But here she was, standing on the beach with the man who had saved her, not just physically, but emotionally as well. Daniel took a deep breath before continuing. "I want to spend the rest of my life with you, Melanie. I want to build a future with you, to share every moment, every joy, every challenge. I love you, more than words can say." Melanie's heart swelled with emotion as she realized what was happening. Daniel reached into his pocket and pulled out a small box, opening it to reveal a sparkling diamond ring. "Will you marry me?" Melanie gasped, her hands flying to her mouth as tears streamed down her face. She had never expected this, never dared to dream that she could find happiness like this again. But now, standing here with Daniel, she knew that this was exactly where she was meant to be. "Yes," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "Yes, Daniel, I'll marry you." Daniel's face broke into a radiant smile as he slipped the ring onto her finger, pulling her into his arms. They stood there, wrapped in each other's embrace, as the sun set behind them, casting a golden glow over the horizon. In that moment, Melanie knew that she had finally found her happy ending. It hadn't been an easy journey, but she had made it. And now, with Daniel by her side, she was ready to face whatever the future held. Together, they would build a life filled with love, trust, and hope. A life that was truly theirs. Thank you for watching. Hope you enjoyed the story. Please don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe for more delightful stories.